The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Murmurs echoed across the polished wooden walls as a man in dusty jeans and worn boots stepped up to the defendant's table. Alone. No briefcase, no lawyer, no polished rhetoric, just determination in his eyes. Across from him, Leonardo Santamaria, one of the most feared attorneys in the city, smirked condescendingly. Clad in a pristine tailored suit, he addressed the judge with theatrical confidence, barely concealing his disdain for the man who dared to stand alone against him. "Your Honor," he began, "we will try to keep this short. The accused has chosen to represent himself. I trust that won't delay us too much." A few in the audience chuckled. Even the judge arched an eyebrow, intrigued. But as Leonardo turned back to his documents, the man, Mateo Garcia, raised his head, and in that moment something shifted. A quiet confidence radiated from him, something that didn't quite fit the image of a humble construction worker, something unexpected. This is not just a courtroom drama. It's the story of a man who had every reason to give up, but didn't. Mateo Garcia isn't fighting for pride or ego. He's fighting for his dignity, for his family, for truth. And what unfolds is a battle that will challenge assumptions, expose corruption, and prove that courage doesn't wear a suit and tie. No one believed he stood a chance. They were all wrong. Don't miss this incredible story of justice and perseverance. If you're ready to be inspired by a man who defied the odds and rewrote his own destiny, make sure to subscribe, like, and share, because this is a journey you'll want to follow to the very end. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Mateo Garcia stood at the door of his modest apartment, hands calloused from years of labor, staring at the official envelope in disbelief. The court seal was unmistakable. He tore it open with trembling fingers, his heart pounding. It was a summons. According to the document, his former employer, one of the largest construction firms in the region, had filed a lawsuit against him. The charge? Gross negligence and property damage resulting in thousands of dollars in losses. If found guilty, Mateo could not only lose his job prospects but face a staggering fine and possibly jail time. For a moment, the weight of it all crashed down on him. He slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, his mind racing. How had it come to this? Just 3 months ago, he'd been managing a small crew on a major construction site. He followed every protocol, respected every rule. But after raising concerns about unsafe materials being used, a shortcut that saved the company money, he noticed his work assignments shrinking. Then, out of nowhere, the accusation came. A collapsed scaffold, which he had repeatedly warned about, had been pinned on him. His calls to the company went unanswered. His attempts to speak with management were stonewalled. And now they were taking him to court. His first instinct was to look for a lawyer, but with barely enough savings to cover rent and food for his 2 kids, the quotes he received were far beyond his means. Legal aid offered no immediate help due to backlogs and delays. Faced with no viable alternative, he made a decision that shocked even himself. "I'll defend myself," he whispered aloud, more to convince himself than anyone else. It wasn't pride, it was necessity. He couldn't afford to let them destroy everything he had built. His family depended on him. His honor depended on it. Over the next few days, Mateo began preparing. He read the court notice a dozen times, researching legal terms late into the night using an old laptop and borrowed Wi-Fi from the cafe downstairs. He wrote notes, watched videos, read public case files, anything he could get his hands on. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he also knew he couldn't just surrender. The morning of the trial arrived. Mateo stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his only clean button-down shirt. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He looked at himself and remembered his father's words. A man's worth is not measured by the wealth he holds, but by the truth he stands for. At the courthouse, he walked through the heavy doors and into the courtroom where people were already seated. The tension in the air was palpable. He spotted the opposing table, sleek suits, stacks of documents, and the unmistakable presence of Leonardo Santamaria, the firm's star attorney, known for tearing defendants apart with surgical precision. As Mateo took his seat alone at the defense table, whispers rippled through the room. Is he really representing himself? He's a goner. This will be over fast. Mateo ignored them. He gripped his notes, took a deep breath, and waited for the judge to enter. This was it. His fight had begun. The courtroom doors opened with a subtle creak, and in walked Leonardo Santamaria. Heads turned, conversations halted. Even the bailiff straightened his posture. Leonardo didn't just enter a room, he claimed it. Tall, composed, and impeccably dressed, he radiated confidence and authority. His eyes scanned the courtroom with a detached indifference, as if it all bored him. He was used to winning, and more importantly, used to making others feel like they never stood a chance. Matteo watched him approach the plaintiff's table, with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Papers were arranged for him, assistants whispered last-minute notes, and still, he barely acknowledged them. His gaze slowly shifted across the room until it landed on Matteo. A faint smirk curled on his lips. "So," he said just loud enough for Matteo to hear, "you're the brave soul who thinks YouTube tutorials can outmatch a law degree." Matteo didn't respond. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew that engaging in small provocations would play right into Leonardo's hands. The lawyer was known for his theatrics, for baiting defendants into emotional outbursts. Matteo held his ground, choosing silence over reaction. Leonardo turned away, feigning disappointment. No response? Pity. I was hoping for at least a little fire. When the judge entered and called the session to order, Leonardo immediately seized control. His opening statement was polished, rehearsed to perfection. He used complex legal terminology, references to precedent, and dramatic pauses that held the room in suspense. "Your Honor," he declared, "this case is not just about negligence. It is about a blatant disregard for professional responsibility. The defendant's actions endangered lives, cost my client thousands, and frankly, mock the very standards this industry is built upon." He paced slightly as he spoke, making eye contact with jurors and emphasizing each point like a seasoned performer. Then he paused, looked at Matteo, and with a voice soaked in false sympathy added, "And while we understand the challenges of navigating the legal system alone, ignorance is no excuse for damage caused. My client is not seeking revenge. We seek justice." The judge nodded, clearly impressed with the presentation. Matteo's turn came, and he stood slowly. He could feel every eye in the room. The contrast between him and Leonardo couldn't have been more stark. There were no rhetorical flourishes in Matteo's words, just quiet determination. "I may not speak like a lawyer," he began, "but I was there. I know what happened, and I believe the truth matters, even if I have to defend it myself." A few eyebrows raised. Leonardo scoffed audibly, whispering something to his assistant. The judge glanced at him but didn't comment. The rest of the session was procedural, setting expectations, reviewing charges, but Leonardo never missed a chance to belittle Matteo with snide comments and dismissive glances. Each time Matteo tried to ask a question or raise a point, Leonardo interrupted with objections or sarcastic remarks. To the spectators, it looked like a lion playing with its prey. But beneath the surface, something was happening. While Leonardo mocked and maneuvered, Matteo was watching, listening, learning. He wasn't intimidated. He was adapting. The day's session ended, and people began filing out. As Matteo gathered his notes, Leonardo passed by and whispered, "You should consider settling. Save yourself the embarrassment." Matteo looked up, eyes steady. "Thanks for the advice," he said quietly, "but I came here for the truth, not your permission." Leonardo raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. The war had just begun, and Matteo had no intention of backing down. The next day, the trial resumed. The air in the courtroom felt different, charged with anticipation. Word had begun to spread about the unrepresented construction worker, taking on one of the city's most formidable lawyers. Spectators filled the benches, curious to witness what many assumed would be a slow, painful defeat. Leonardo Santamaria arrived with the same smug confidence, his suit pristine, his briefcase polished, his every movement calculated for effect. Matteo, by contrast, walked in alone, clutching a notebook filled with scribbled notes and highlighted pages. The judge entered, the bailiff called the court to order, and proceedings began. From the very start, Leonardo attacked. "Your Honor," he began, "I'd like to remind the court that while the defendant has chosen to represent himself, this does not exempt him from the standards and expectations of proper legal conduct. We must ensure this trial maintains integrity." The judge nodded. "Of course, Mr. Garcia, you are expected to follow courtroom procedure. If at any point you require clarification, address the court directly." Matteo stood. "Understood, Your Honor." Leonardo's smirk returned. Witnesses were called, former colleagues, site managers, even a corporate safety inspector. Leonardo questioned them with precision, leading them carefully through rehearsed narratives that painted Matteo as careless, disobedient, and reckless. When it was Matteo's turn to cross-examine, his voice was unsure at first. He stumbled over legal jargon. He hesitated before speaking. The courtroom responded with raised brows and suppressed laughter. Leonardo leaned back, arms folded, clearly enjoying the show. But Matteo didn't retreat. As the questioning progressed, he began to find his footing. He asked practical, grounded questions, not from a textbook, but from lived experience. He pointed out site-specific details that only someone who had worked the job could understand. Still, the courtroom favored Leonardo. The judge interrupted Matteo more often. Spectators whispered critiques. The legal imbalance was obvious. During a short recess, Matteo sat alone on a bench outside the courtroom, watching lawyers pace with cell phones and assistants at their heels. He was an outsider in every way, yet he refused to let it break him. He remembered nights on the construction site, solving problems with limited tools and impossible deadlines. He wasn't new to pressure. He just needed to approach this the same way, one piece at a time. Back in court, Leonardo grew bolder. During one exchange, he directly mocked Matteo's lack of legal expertise. "Mr. Garcia," he said with a chuckle, "do you even understand the burden of proof in a negligence claim?" Matteo didn't flinch. "Yes," he replied calmly, "and I also understand that burden applies to you, not me." A few heads turned. Leonardo raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Matteo had landed his first real strike. Still, the day ended with more setbacks than wins. The courtroom remained unconvinced. The judge seemed skeptical of Matteo's ability to defend himself, and yet beneath the surface, something had begun to shift. Leonardo, for all his skill, had underestimated him. Matteo didn't need to win the room in a single day. He just needed to stay in the fight. That night, after another exhausting day in court, Matteo sat at his kitchen table long after his children had gone to bed. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. Spread before him were pages of handwritten notes, legal articles printed from the public library, and a second-hand copy of a legal dictionary with dog-eared pages. His eyes burned from reading, but he couldn't stop. He had stumbled across something in court, an energy, a spark. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was just surviving the trial. He felt like he was learning. As he reviewed testimony transcripts, a memory resurfaced, one from years ago before construction became his life. Back when he was just a teenager, he would sneak into the back of the university law building where his cousin worked as a janitor. While his cousin mopped floors, Matteo would sit outside the lecture halls listening through the open doors. He was captivated by the way the professors spoke, by the structure of the arguments, the flow of logic. He remembered once borrowing a casebook left on a bench and reading it for days. But life didn't wait. Family responsibilities, bills, and the need for immediate income had taken him down a different road. Still, the fascination had never left him. Back in the present, something clicked. He began cross-referencing what he'd heard in court with what he was reading. Legal strategies, evidentiary rules, the structure of questioning. He was beginning to see patterns, to understand the rhythm beneath the noise. He didn't need a degree to see that some of Leonardo's tactics relied not just on fact, but intimidation, misdirection, style over substance. In court the next morning, that shift began to show. When the opposing side presented more evidence, a technical report about the scaffold collapse, Leonardo confidently asked that it be admitted as definitive proof of Matteo's fault. Matteo stood. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, surprising even himself. "The report references only the final inspection. It doesn't include the maintenance logs or pre-installation checks." The judge glanced over. "Mr. Santa Maria." Leonardo adjusted his tie. "It's standard protocol, but not comprehensive," Matteo added. "Without the full documentation, it presents an incomplete picture." There was a beat of silence. The judge nodded slowly. "Objection sustained, Mr. Santa Maria. Please ensure all relevant documentation is included going forward." Leonardo shot a glance at Matteo, one of subtle irritation. That afternoon, during witness questioning, Matteo demonstrated more control. His voice grew steadier, his questions more focused. He challenged timelines, asked about safety protocols, and even corrected a misused legal term in a report. The audience, once smugly dismissive, grew quiet, curious, watching. By the time court adjourned, Leonardo lingered at the plaintiff's table longer than usual, reviewing his notes with more intensity. Matteo, packing up his things, didn't say a word. But inside he felt it. The shift. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was strategizing. The talent he'd buried for years, his love of logic, of argument, of truth was surfacing. Not in a grand cinematic way, but in steady, methodical steps. And for the first time, he allowed himself to think something dangerous. Maybe I can actually win this. Matteo spent the weekend preparing, but this time he wasn't just cramming, he was strategizing. Every moment in court so far had revealed something about the way Leonardo operated. His reliance on theatrics, his tendency to gloss over technical specifics, his assumption that no one would dare question him. Matteo began to build a plan, not just to defend himself, but to dismantle the case from the inside out. On Monday morning, he walked into the courtroom not as an overwhelmed worker, but as someone with a mission. Leonardo launched into his next phase of arguments, citing employee testimony that painted Matteo as careless. He referenced time cards, safety logs, and statements from a foreman. On the surface, it all seemed airtight, but Matteo had done his homework. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he stepped forward with quiet confidence. He called up one of the site supervisors and flipped to a copy of the time card Leonardo had introduced. This document says, "I was clocked in from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. on the day of the incident, correct?" Matteo asked. "Yes," the supervisor replied. Matteo nodded. "Then how do you explain this internal email sent at 7:15 a.m. that same day, where I reported a structural concern about the scaffold before the shift even started?" He held up a printed email, which had been obtained through a public request from a former colleague still sympathetic to his cause. The supervisor froze. Leonardo stood up. "Objection. This wasn't submitted as part of the official." Matteo turned calmly to the judge. "I received this over the weekend, Your Honor. It's relevant, and I'm prepared to authenticate the source." The judge examined the document. "I'll allow it." Leonardo's jaw tightened. From that moment on, the balance shifted. Matteo began introducing small but precise pieces of evidence: overlooked inspection forms, texts between crew members, copies of supply orders that contradicted Leonardo's claims. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, but each one chipped away at the polished narrative the company had built. Leonardo grew visibly frustrated. His once flawless arguments began to show cracks, and the spectators noticed. In one particularly tense moment, Leonardo attempted to dismiss a statement Matteo cited. "That document has no legal bearing. It's anecdotal at best," he snapped. Matteo didn't flinch. "Actually, under Article 14, Section B of the Labor Compliance Act, first-person written observations submitted to a supervisor are admissible as supporting testimony, especially if corroborated by third-party records." A stunned silence followed. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Leonardo blinked. "Where did you study law, Mr. Garcia?" Matteo looked him in the eye. "Construction sites, night shifts, public libraries." A ripple of murmurs ran through the audience. Leonardo turned away, muttering under his breath. But Matteo wasn't finished. He returned to the original accusation, the scaffold collapse. He pointed to a document detailing material shipments and highlighted a discrepancy. The safety brackets listed in the report didn't match the ones actually used on site. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor, this could indicate either an error or a deliberate substitution of inferior materials." The judge raised an eyebrow. "That is a serious claim." Matteo nodded. "Yes, sir, and I intend to prove it." The courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. No one was smirking. Even Leonardo's assistant looked uneasy. Matteo had gone from a man scrambling to survive to a man controlling the flow of the battle. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about exposing a deeper truth, and he was just getting started. By the fourth day of trial, the courtroom felt different. Gone were the dismissive whispers, the smug glances, the quiet bets against Matteo. In their place was something heavier, attention, the kind that filled the air dense with curiosity and disbelief. People had started arriving early just to find a seat. Law students, local reporters, even off-duty attorneys sat in the gallery, all drawn by the rumor, "The construction worker who's outsmarting Leonardo Santamaria." Leonardo, once effortlessly dominant, now seemed a shade dimmer, his tone sharper, his patience thinner. And Matteo, He walked into court the way he once walked onto a job site, steady, alert, focused. He had no illusions of grandeur. He wasn't trying to be a lawyer. He was trying to tell the truth, and truth had a rhythm of its own. As the session began, Matteo called his next witness, a former co-worker who had originally declined to testify. But after following the case from a distance and seeing how Matteo handled himself, he'd changed his mind. Under oath, the witness confirmed what Matteo had suggested the day before, that the materials delivered to the site did not match the official purchase orders. "The brackets we received weren't what we were supposed to get," the man said. "We flagged it to management, but they told us to keep quiet, said it wasn't our concern." Leonardo stood quickly. "Hearsay. This is conjecture." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Santamaria, sit down. I'll determine what carries weight." Leonardo hesitated, then obeyed. As the testimony continued, the courtroom leaned in. The narrative was shifting, from a story of negligence to a story of corporate cost-cutting, from Matteo's supposed recklessness to a deeper question. Had the company knowingly used substandard materials and found a scapegoat when it all went wrong? During the lunch break, a few people approached Matteo in the hallway. "You're doing something incredible," one woman said softly. "My brother's been through something like this. He gave up. You didn't." Matteo nodded, humbled but wary. He couldn't let support turn into distraction. He still had ground to cover. Back inside, the judge began taking more notes. He asked Matteo for clarification rather than brushing him aside, and for the first time he challenged Leonardo's objections with equal scrutiny. During cross-examination, Leonardo attempted to dismantle the witness's credibility, but it came across forced, defensive. "You never mentioned these claims in your original statement," he barked. The witness shrugged. "I wasn't asked." Laughter rippled through the gallery. Leonardo glared, then regrouped. Matteo took notes silently, letting the moment pass. As the day drew to a close, the judge addressed both parties. "I want both sides to prepare for final arguments. Based on what's been presented so far, the court will also consider the validity of the original claim beyond simple negligence." That meant something big. It meant the court was no longer just evaluating whether Matteo had done something wrong, but whether the company itself had abused the legal process to protect its interests. Leonardo froze for half a second. Matteo, tired but steady, simply nodded. Outside, reporters waited for statements. Matteo said nothing. He had no press agent, no carefully crafted soundbite. He just walked past the cameras and headed home to tuck his children into bed. But the city was buzzing. People were talking. Something about the story resonated, because deep down, everyone had felt underestimated at some point. Everyone had been looked down on. Everyone wanted to believe that given the chance they too could rise, and Matteo Garcia was proving it could be done. The courtroom was quiet. Not the kind of quiet born from boredom, but the electric stillness that precedes something important, something irreversible. Matteo stood before the court, a small folder of documents in his hand. He had spent the night reviewing every piece of evidence, every statement, every angle. He wasn't just looking for a gap. He was waiting for the moment. And now it had arrived. "Your Honor," he said, stepping forward, "with the court's permission, I'd like to submit a new piece of evidence discovered through a public access request filed last week." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Matteo handed the bailiff a printed report, an internal maintenance log from the construction company, dated just 2 days before the scaffold collapse. He let the judge review it in silence before continuing. "This log," Matteo explained, "shows a recorded warning from a site inspector stating that the scaffold was unstable due to incorrect assembly. It was flagged. No action was taken." Leonardo stood abruptly. "Objection. This was not submitted during discovery. This is a last-minute ambush." Matteo held his ground. "I filed for this document 2 weeks ago. The delay was on the company's end. I have confirmation of my request and time-stamped emails to prove it." The judge raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Santamaria. I'll allow it." Leonardo clenched his jaw but complied. Matteo turned to the gallery. "This document proves that the issue wasn't me. The scaffold was already compromised. Management knew and chose to ignore it, and when it failed, they blamed the easiest target, me." The judge looked over the papers again, now with a more intense focus. Leonardo, struggling to regain control, tried to discredit Matteo's interpretation. You're not qualified to assess technical documentation, but I am qualified to know what happened that day, Matteo shot back. I was there. I handled that scaffold. I reported the instability and I was ignored. He paused, then added, You weren't there, Mr. Santamaria. You've just been telling stories. I've been telling the truth. A long silence followed. Even the jury, silent until now, seemed to sit up straighter. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Santamaria, does your team have an explanation for this oversight? Leonardo adjusted his tie. I will need time to confer with my client. Understood, the judge replied. But let the record show this evidence significantly alters the context of the claims. Matteo returned to his seat, his hands still but his pulse racing. He could feel the atmosphere shift. The energy in the room was no longer against him. If anything, it was holding its breath for what came next. Later that day, Matteo took the stand to give his own testimony. For the first time, it wasn't about defense. It was about clarity. He spoke of the unsafe materials, the ignored warnings, the days leading up to the collapse. He described the pressure to stay silent and the fear of losing his job if he pushed too hard. He spoke plainly but with purpose. When Leonardo attempted to trip him up during cross-examination, Matteo remained calm. Isn't it true, Leonardo asked, that you have no formal training in law, in engineering or corporate policy? Matteo nodded. That's true, but I have something your client forgot to account for. And what's that? Leonardo sneered. Matteo looked straight at him. Accountability. The room fell still once more. The judge called for adjournment, announcing that closing statements would begin the next day. As the crowd filed out, whispers swirled, many no longer about whether Matteo could win, but about how close he was to doing exactly that. And for the first time since the trial began, Leonardo Santamaria walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The courtroom was at capacity, every bench filled, every standing spot taken. Even the judge seemed more alert than usual, aware that the case had grown far beyond its original scope. What began as a small legal battle between an unrepresented worker and a large construction company had turned into something much more, something symbolic. Matteo sat quietly at the defense table, his notes in perfect order. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't even tired anymore. He was ready. Leonardo Santamaria entered with less flair than usual. Gone was the swagger. Gone was the smirk. In its place, a kind of forced composure. His client hadn't joined him in person today, opting instead to monitor remotely, a decision that, to some, already hinted at retreat. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Garcia, you may proceed with your final submission of evidence before we begin closing statements. Matteo stood. Thank you, Your Honor. I have one last document to present, a clause from the company's own employee protection policy, page 14, section 3.2. He handed a printed copy to the judge and opposing counsel. This clause, Matteo continued, states that any employee who reports a safety hazard in writing is entitled to a formal review process before any disciplinary action can be taken. He let that hang for a moment. I submitted a written report about the scaffold's instability, dated and time-stamped. That alone should have triggered a review. But instead I was removed from the site and blamed for the collapse, without investigation, without process, without defense. The judge flipped through the document. Mr. Santamaria, are you aware of this clause? Leonardo hesitated. This section was not relevant to our claim. Matteo spoke again, his voice unwavering. With respect, Your Honor, it's entirely relevant. Not only does it show that the company failed to follow its own procedures, it undermines the credibility of their entire case. Leonardo stood, now visibly uncomfortable. This is an obscure clause buried in boilerplate, Matteo interrupted. Obscure, maybe, but not meaningless and certainly not missed. He turned toward the gallery, then looked directly at Leonardo. In fact, he said, I believe Mr. Santamaria saw this clause weeks ago and chose to ignore it. The judge narrowed his eyes. Do you have proof of that? Matteo took a breath. I do. He walked to the evidence table and lifted a stack of emails obtained through a legal records request. At the top was an internal email exchange between Leonardo and the company's HR department, dated 2 weeks before the trial began. One line stood out. Yes, I'm aware of the clause, but it's unlikely the defendant will find it or know how to apply it. The courtroom gasped. Leonardo's face went pale. Matteo continued. This wasn't just negligence. It was a calculated attempt to suppress the truth, to bet on the idea that someone like me, someone without a law degree, without connections, wouldn't be able to fight back. The judge held up the printed emails, scanning them in silence. His expression darkened. "Mr. Santamaria," he said sternly, "this court takes willful suppression of internal policies very seriously. I will be ordering a full review of the company's conduct and yours." Leonardo sank into his chair. Matteo looked down at his table, hands steady. He had done what he came to do. He had turned the tide, not with fury, but with facts, with truth, with persistence. As the judge announced a brief recess before final arguments, the entire room seemed to exhale. Matteo had revealed what no one expected, that beneath the surface of corporate legal games and courtroom intimidation, there was a man who had not only fought for his name, but had outwitted one of the most powerful lawyers in the region. And now the end was near. The room fell into complete silence as the judge returned from recess. The final stretch had begun. Everyone knew it. The spectators leaned forward, breaths held. Even the sound of the gavel striking the desk felt sharper. "Mr. Santamaria," the judge announced, "you may begin your closing statement." Leonardo stood slowly. Gone was the polished arrogance. He adjusted his tie with a shaky hand, then approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what we've witnessed here is unusual. A man defending himself. A case that has shifted tone more than once. But I urge you to remember, this isn't a courtroom drama. It's a legal matter. And emotions, while powerful, must not cloud facts." He paced, trying to recover his rhythm. "Yes, mistakes may have been made by my client, oversights, but those do not change the core issue. Mr. Garcia was the one in charge of that section of the site." That scaffold collapsed on his watch. He paused, looking to the jury. "Ask yourselves, would you trust someone without formal training to handle a structure that could take lives if done wrong?" He was trying to rebuild control, to plant doubt, but it was too late. When it was Matteo's turn, he walked forward, not with bravado, but with clarity, with purpose. "I'm not here to play a role," he began. "I'm not trained in legal theatrics. I've made mistakes, stumbled with words, misquoted terms, but I never lied. I showed you what really happened. I backed it up with facts, with documents, with the voices of people who were there." He held up the printed email again. "You saw the message. A lawyer and a company betting I wouldn't find the truth. That I wasn't smart enough to stand here." Matteo looked toward the jury. "But I did. Not because I have a degree, but because I had to." He took a deep breath. "This isn't just about a scaffold. It's about how power tries to silence those without it. It's about what happens when someone with less money, less education, and less influence decides not to back down." The room was dead silent. "I don't expect applause, I don't expect pity, I expect justice. And not just for me, but for every worker who's ever been told they don't matter." He turned back to the judge and nodded. "That's all." The judge gave a subtle nod, then called the court into deliberation. For the next 40 minutes, tension wrapped itself around the courtroom like a storm cloud. No one moved, no one spoke. Matteo sat with his hands folded in his lap. Leonardo, meanwhile, had his face buried in paperwork, though everyone could see his fingers tapping restlessly on the table. Finally, the bailiff stepped forward. "The jury has reached a verdict." Everyone stood. The judge took the paper, scanned it, and looked up. "In the matter of Garcia versus Build-Right Construction, this court finds in favor of the defendant, Mr. Matteo Garcia." Gasps, applause, a few stifled tears. Matteo remained still for a moment, trying to absorb it. Then he exhaled. Leonardo sat back, stunned, but the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he added, "due to evidence of potential misconduct by the plaintiff and its legal representation, a formal investigation will be launched into the fabrication of evidence and suppression of internal policy." It was over, and yet it was just beginning for Leonardo. Matteo turned and looked at the spectators. He saw faces, some smiling, some in awe, some simply changed. He hadn't just defended himself, he had forced a reckoning. And as the gavel struck for the final time that day, the sound wasn't just an ending, it was a declaration. Matteo Garcia had won. The courtroom emptied slowly, but no one left in a hurry. Conversations hummed in every corner, about justice, about courage, about how a man with no legal title had just outclassed one of the most seasoned attorneys in the city. Matteo stood near the exit accepting quiet handshakes, a few heartfelt hugs from strangers, but his focus remained forward. Something told him it wasn't over just yet, and he was right. Just as he turned to leave, the court clerk called out, "Mr. Garcia, the judge has requested your presence in chambers." Alone, Mateo hesitated for a beat, then nodded. Inside the judge's office, the atmosphere shifted. The formality was still there, but behind it was something deeper, a kind of personal respect. "Have a seat, Mr. Garcia," the judge said. "You've conducted yourself with extraordinary discipline." "Thank you, Your Honor," Mateo replied cautiously. "I called you here because I want you to hear this before the press gets hold of it." He handed Mateo a sealed document. An anonymous source has submitted proof that not only did the plaintiff's legal team withhold internal safety reports, they altered several of them before filing. The tampering is undeniable. Mateo's eyes widened. "They forged documents?" The judge nodded grimly. "It's beyond misconduct. It's criminal." Mateo leaned back, absorbing the weight of what that meant. His fight had started as a defense. It had become an exposure of injustice. But now it was a turning point for the entire company and its star lawyer. "An independent investigation will proceed immediately," the judge continued, "and Mr. Santamaria will face a disciplinary hearing before the bar. Possible disbarment, possibly more." Mateo sat in stunned silence. Then came the final twist. "There's something else," the judge added, reaching into a drawer and sliding over a second envelope. This came from the dean of the local law school. Mateo opened it. Inside was a letter offering him a full scholarship to begin formal legal studies. "They saw the transcripts," the judge explained. "They've been following the case. Apparently they believe your mind belongs in a courtroom." Mateo's hands trembled. All the sleepless nights, the self-doubt, the years of pushing down a buried passion, and now an open door, a real chance to walk through it. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Because justice," the judge said, "isn't just about who's right. It's about who's willing to fight for it, and people like you. We need more of them." When Mateo finally stepped outside, the press was waiting. But so was something else. A quiet sense of victory, not just over the case, but over every voice that had told him he wasn't enough. Leonardo, meanwhile, wasn't just facing professional ruin. He was facing public accountability. News spread fast. The arrogant lawyer who tried to bury a worker with lies had been exposed by the very man he mocked. Mateo didn't rejoice in Leonardo's downfall. That was never the goal. His goal had always been the truth. And now, the truth had prevailed. Back home that night, he tucked his kids into bed just as he always did. But this time, there was something new in the air. A calm, a promise, and maybe, just maybe, a future he'd never dared to imagine before. In the distance, the city lights glowed brighter than usual. Or maybe he just saw them differently now, because Mateo Garcia had walked into a courtroom alone and walked out not only vindicated but transformed. The case was over. The courtroom was silent. The crowds dispersed. But for Mateo Garcia, something deeper had shifted, something that went beyond verdicts and applause. He returned to his life with the same humility he carried into court. But now, there was a quiet confidence in every step. He wasn't just a construction worker who had won a legal battle. He was a symbol of what happens when truth meets courage. Shortly after the trial, the investigation into Build Right construction began. Executives were questioned, documents were subpoenaed, and internal policies were rewritten. Leonardo Santamaria's name disappeared from the firm's website. His bar license was suspended pending further review. And Mateo? He accepted the scholarship, not for prestige, not for revenge, but because something had awakened in him. A calling he had buried long ago under years of cement dust and blueprints. He enrolled in night classes, balancing work and study, driven not by ambition, but by purpose. One evening, as he walked across the campus courtyard after class, a professor approached him and said, "You speak like someone who's been through fire." Mateo smiled. "I didn't go through it alone. I carried my family, my dignity, and the truth with me. What began as a desperate defense had become a new beginning, because intelligence isn't measured by degrees, and justice doesn't wear expensive suits. It lives in those brave enough to chase it, no matter the cost." Mateo's story reminds us that standing up for yourself can change everything. So if you were moved by this journey, if you believe in the power of perseverance, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story, because somewhere, someone else is being told they're not good enough, and they need to hear what Matteo did next.